This video is about the techniques Africans use to create art and utilitarian objects, including cloth dyeing and weaving, iron smelting and forging, pottery forming and firing, and wood carving. I have made the videos in Burkina Faso and Ghana over the years since 2001. They demonstrate that Africa continues to be a place of great cultural creativity, where hard-working people use technology that they have developed over millennia to fashion the interesting, useful, and beautiful things that are very important to their lives. Africans have used some of these techniques for centuries, especially iron and pottery technology and wood carving. Others, such as cotton spinning and weaving, have come to West Africa much more recently. But in all cases, these are appropriate technologies for the African environment. They use minimum amounts of materials that are available locally and consume minimum amounts of fuel and other valuable resources to create objects that are ideal for the people and uses to which they are put. As an example, pottery is fired to a low temperature, which leaves it a bit fragile and even porous. But this same pottery can easily be used for cooking over an open fire, something that is not possible with more sophisticated, higher-fired porcelain and stoneware. African artists are best known for their sculpture in wood. Students and scholars, museum-goers and art collectors have been fascinated by African figures and masks for decades. African artists carve masks of wood to represent the spiritual beings who watch over their communities and protect them from harm, both physical and spiritual. Because these spirits are invisible, their images must be invented. Because the spirits are abstract, the carved images that represent them are also abstract. This artist from the Bois village of Boni is carving a mask to represent a spirit that appeared in the form of a crocodile. He is carving it for the Nyumu family in the village of Boni. He begins by offering a chicken on his axe and prayers to the spirit of the tree so his work will be successful. He uses the wood of the ceiba tree, Ceiba pentandra in Latin, because its wood is light but solid with a good grain for carving. African artists never carve the wood of the kapok or baobab trees, whose wood is useless for carving. They never use ebony either, unless they are carving objects to sell to tourists. After he has felled the tree, he divides it into sections of the required length, marks out the proportions of the mask, and removes excess wood in large chunks. The goal is to reduce the block of wood to almost the size needed for the mask, so it becomes light enough to transport to his workshop on the back of his bicycle. He carves with a short-handled adze, with a very sharp iron blade. He can cut parallel to the grain to remove thin layers of wood, or at a steep angle across the grain to remove large chunks of wood. He marks out the dimensions using a short measuring stick and a piece of charcoal. At this point, the shape of the body, tail, legs, head, and the round rim that touches the performer's face are easy to see. Now the mask is just the right size and shape. He darkens it with black pigment and marks out the graphic patterns, which the Bois calls scars. He cuts the scars using a sharp adze blade he has removed from the wooden handle. When he has completed carving, he carries the mask to the mask's storeroom in the village, where he transfers the spiritual power from the old mask to the new one. The old mask has been used for many years, has been soaked and washed several times to remove insects, and will now be sold to a European art dealer. The same artists who carve objects in the forest for village use also carve in a workshop in Boni objects to be sold to tourists who visit the village or to be sent to Ouagadougou.
Voilà, enfin le papillon 00 vient d'être terminé à peu près par M. Bondé Nikenyino, sculpteur abonné. Il travaille avec moi il y a longtemps.
Here are 3 bois plank masks that have been blocked out and then placed in the sun to dry before the details are carved. These masks will be much smaller than the traditional masks, so that they are easy for tourists to carry back to France or America.
Oui, je vais le voir. Très très intéressant, oui. Oui. Puisque les animaux doivent danser d'abord et ensuite, maintenant les enfants vont danser aussi.
This is a sign the carvers set up along the road advertising the workshop. Unfortunately, it attracted the attention of the tax collectors, so they had to remove it. This carver is piercing the holes around the rim of the mask that permit him to attach the fiber costume. He pierces the holes with red-hot iron awls, or pokers. After the masks have been carved and painted, the artists smoke them in the rafters of a family kitchen for several weeks until they have taken on the dark, sooty appearance and smell that tourists think means they are old masks. The artists may also bleach the interior of the mask where the dancer's chin and cheeks touch, so it appears the mask has been discolored by the performer's sweat. In 2004, I visited a workshop near Kumasi in Ghana, where a group of carvers carve wooden stools.
I am by name Clement Dapa of Ghana Wood Carving Center. I'm in to introduce or show the man the name of the stools, the type of wood, and the use of the stools. And those people who usually occupy the stools in different styles. This is the white wood. It's by name Sese. It's by name Sese. We have 2 types of wood. We have the red one and we have the white one, as I've mentioned. The red one is by name Sidera, or you can even say mahogany. They are all in the same species. This is white wood for the king of Techiman. There are so many different styles for the chiefs and queen mothers in Ashanti. And every queen mother or every king has got his or her stool. That's why I said this is the king of Techiman. You have the queen mother stool. Okay. This is the queen mother of Ashanti stool. This is the Queen Mother of Ashanti. We have the King of Ashanti. Utufo will say to two. Yeah. When you come here, we have the same Queen Mother's too, but it's a big size, and we have the smaller size. You have the Jinyame in the Queen Mother way, and we have the Jinyame in the Queen Mother way. As I've explained to you, these are the smaller king stools. King stools, King of Ashanti. We have many different designs, but the most important ones are the Queen Mother, as I've explained to you, and the King, as I've explained to you. But the other sub-chiefs in Ashanti and Queen Mothers have got their own separate style of the stool.
Every Asante person, male or female, owns a wooden stool, which is his or her personal property. Only the owner sits on the stool, and the stool becomes a precious personal dwelling place for the owner's spirit. This is such an important idea that Asante do not leave their personal stools standing upright when they get up and leave, lest a malevolent spirit occupy it. Instead, they lean the stool on its side or tilt it against the wall so that it cannot be occupied. Once a year, the family ritually scrubs all of the stools in the home to purify them, and the stools are fresh, bright white wood as long as the owners live. If the owner has been very successful, accomplished, and prosperous, when he or she dies, the personal stool is blackened and placed in the family ancestral shrine, where offerings of eggs and Dutch schnapps can be made to the spirit of the deceased. As you can see, the Asante carvers use long-handled knives to carve out details and to finish the surface. When the entire stool has been completed, they use sandpaper they buy at the hardware store to sand down the surface and make it smooth. Throughout this video, I narrate in the present tense, as if all of these traditions were still practiced by all Asante or Mosi or other African peoples. In fact, some of these people have converted to Christianity or Islam in the near or recent past, and no longer practice the old African traditions. Nevertheless, many people still practice the traditions of their ancestors, and so I persist in using the present when I describe what they do and believe. Although the earliest textiles were probably made from pounded bark cloth, like the tapa cloth of Polynesian islanders, cotton technology arrived in sub-Saharan Africa from the north, where cotton is easily grown and where the narrow double-heddle loom originated. In West Africa, men used double-heddle narrow-band horizontal looms like the ones you see here, while women use vertical, single-heddle broadlooms. I do not have films of women's looms because they are so rare in the areas where I have filmed. The Asante and Ewe people of Ghana probably learned to weave cotton and other yarns within the last few centuries, but they have become very highly skilled weavers who create very complex and beautiful textiles. To weave cloth, one must first have thread or yarn. Mostly women spin thread from raw cotton they grow in their own fields. The cotton is seeded and carded, which straightens the fibers in one direction. This elderly Mosi woman is named Winiesiga Bamago. She is one of the most senior elders of the Bamago clan in the village of Dablo. She holds the carded cotton on a staff called a distaff in her left hand, and with her right hand she spins a small drop spindle. The drop spindle has a clay weight on the bottom end, which gives it rotational momentum. The spinning spindle twists the cotton fibers into thread. As she works, she stretches the fibers out so that the diameter of the thread is as uniform as possible. Occasionally, she dips her fingers in a shallow bowl of wood ash to give them a snap when she spins the spindle. She can spin 1 or 2 pounds of cotton into a substantial quantity of thread in one day. She then takes the thread to a weaver and pays him to weave it into a full cloth. I photographed this elderly man and his co-workers at the dye pits in the village of Buse 30 years ago. Since 1976, the industry has declined enormously and has almost disappeared. In 1976, there were almost 100 dye pits being constantly worked by dozens of craftsmen. Almost all of the pits are now full of dust and trash, and only 3 are still used. Few people in Burkina Faso wear homespun and dyed cloth anymore. Instead, they wear second-hand clothing imported to local markets by entrepreneurs. One of the largest and richest of these importers is a personal friend of the Chief of State. The dye is indigo, which farmers grow locally. Indigo is one of the oldest and most valuable cash crops in Africa. The dried leaves are mixed with sludge from the bottom of the dye pit, and thoroughly stirred and mixed into the water. The ash from the dye pit forms a mordant, which causes the dye color to be absorbed into the cotton cloth. The indigo dye is green, not blue, when the cloth is first soaked in it. When the dye is exposed to the air, it oxidizes and quickly turns blue. The dyer must dip the cloth into the dye and squeeze it through, then hang the cloth to drip and change color. He then repeats the process several times until the cloth is dark blue. The darker the color, the more costly the dyed textile. The Cape Verde Islands lie off the coast of Senegal in the Atlantic Ocean. They were an important Portuguese colony from the 15th century until independence in 1975. During much of this period, the Portuguese earned huge profits in the slave trade, carrying captured slaves from Elmina in Ghana and from Gorée in Dakar Harbor to Brazil and Cuba. They made an effort to capture slaves who were skilled weavers and shipped them to Cape Verde, or Cabo Verde in Portuguese. They set the slave weavers up with looms and forced them to weave complex and quite beautiful cotton textiles called paños. These famous paños were then used as currency by slave traders who purchased more slaves along the coast of West Africa and shipped them to the Americas to grow sugarcane. This skilled weaver is named Eric Sanchez. He works in a small village near Santa Catarina, about 2 hours' drive through enormous green mountains north of Praia, the capital of Cape Verde.
More than weaving. So weaving is not the only thing he does.
Yes.
Does he do farming too, or does he do other kinds of labor?
Agricultor.
Yes. So the patterns are more complex and more beautiful than almost any other weaving I've seen in Africa, except kente cloth. You know, Shanti kente is very beautiful.
Com a mostra já faz.
Você pensa arranja para pôr no museu?
Ah, tem carpinteiro.
Pode ter nenhum que está vendo?
Não.
Não.
And we can help him.
Yeah.
We take this from the museum.
To take the museum and give him enough money to buy a new one. That's good. The weft patterns are more complex. Does he weave just because he wants to, or does he only weave if somebody orders? If somebody orders a piece of cloth?
Yes. What?
Il fait les tissages seulement si quelqu'un va le commander?
Non, il le fait toujours.
Il le fait
Là,
toujours.
il le fait. Il y a une dame qui a besoin de ce style.
Ok.
Sempre essa pergunta se sempre você faz trabalho, sempre se aquele tipo de profissão, ou você está fazendo para modo de ter encomenda. Se que tem encomenda, fazer como você faz?
Se que tem encomenda, se crê que tem encomenda, não faz também, sempre.
Il dit qu'il vit de ça. Même si on n'y a pas de commande, il est obligé toujours de faire. Il dit qu'il ne sait faire que ça.
Ok, donc
Il dit qu'il y a des gens qui têm na Lisboa.
Só na cá que tem que na Lisboa tem também mais, é diferente. Sim, então.
Qualidade melhor ou pior?
Tem bom qualidade, mas isso aqui é
You can see that Eric Sanchez uses several sets of heddles to lift the warp threads as he passes the weft threads across left to right and back. These extra heddles permit him to weave complex patterns more quickly than if he opens the warps with his fingers, as you see in the films of Asante and Evi weavers in Ghana. At the same time, the use of multiple heddles results in textiles in which the patterns are intricate but very regular and repetitive.
Il ne le trouve qu'à Dakar. Donc, ceux qui viennent d'ailleurs du Portugal ou d'Europe ne correspondent à la grosseur.
Oui, la grossesse n'est pas bon, c'est trop épais ou quelque chose comme ça. Oui, parce qu'à Dakar, sans doute, ils font et vendent beaucoup de fils pour les tisserands partout en Afrique. Est-ce qu'il y a
Mais autrefois, le pagne ancien, c'était pano bicho, pano dobra, barafula.
Sim, tem tudo. Tem pano tem três tipos, pano bicho, pano dobra, pano chão.
Exato, pano chão.
Et tous ces noms-là des différents pagnes, ça dépend de dessin ou de couleur ou...
De dessin, de la largeur de chaque bande.
D'accord.
Et le nombre de bandes aussi.
Ok.
Ouais.
Et quel était...
Il y a les dessins.
Quel était le nom de pagne avec les plus petites bandes et les dessins les plus complexes?
En noir, c'est pas le bicho.
En noir.
Ce qui est plus courant.
Oui, ce qui est le plus traditionnel.
Et pas le bicho que alguém se encontrava mais ou não?
Pano bicho. Não, mas trabalhar é pano dobra.
Pano dobra.
Pano dobra.
Pano dobra que é mais trabalhado. Tem aquele tipo almofadado.
Pano dobra é suficiente. Pano dobra que tem cheio de dizer, que tem um parte que tem chão.
E tem aquele almofadado.
Sim.
Il dit que celui...
C'est ce que tu as filmé aux archives là.
Aux archives.
Oui, c'est ça.
Le bleu que tu as filmé aux archives, c'est plein de dessins. C'est le pano dobra.
Et est-ce qu'il...
Obra, c'est travail.
Oui. Et est-ce qu'il sait où on peut trouver... Est-ce qu'il a peur que les vieilles dames vont cesser de porter ça et que puis il y aura plus de travail?
Essa pergunta é se nós estamos com medo porque o trabalho desaparece, por exemplo, mulher que está por mais e, por exemplo, se você é capaz até de perder o emprego.
Se quer muito.
Com licença. O problema é que você está tendo em conta que...
Não, eu queria que você pergunte.
Você pergunta aí. Essa toda se trabalho que está, por exemplo, se chega um momento que tu usa mais que esse tipo de pano, se bate pode acontecer.
Não.
Quer dizer, antigo dia que você está mais.
Aquele que se amara, o gosto é pano que se amara.
Sim, são mulheres de chemise avec quelques bandes.
Oui.
He also frequently uses a shed stick which, when turned on its side, forms a space through which the weft threads can be passed.
Et ils ont de déboucher.
D'accord.
Hein?
Oui.
Donc je crois qu'il n'y a pas de péril.
Oui. Parce que
du pain disparaître.
Ça change et ils font les commandes pour les produits qui sont différents.
Voilà.
Donc ils ne dépendent pas seulement sur les vieilles femmes.
Voilà.
Parce que les gens après ils vont faire les chemises et les choses comme ça. Donc il n'a pas peur que ça va disparaître.
Oui.
Ça, c'est une bonne idée.
Après, on pourrait lécher la dame là.
So far we have seen kente weaving by Asante and Ewe in Ghana and the people of Cape Verde. Farther north, in most of the cities of sub-Saharan Africa, Niamey, Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, Bamako, Mopti, Djenné, and Timbuktu, merchants have set up large workshops where groups of men work together to weave the narrow-band textiles for which the region is famous. The merchant purchases the yarn and pays the weavers a salary based on how much they weave. He keeps the profit. These men are weaving narrow bands of cloth that they will sew edge to edge to form a full blanket. There are very few weft floats or tapestry patterns of any kind. Those take too long. They use only one pair of heddles. There are twice as many weft threads per inch as warp threads, so only the colors of the wefts show in the finished fabric. They weave solid blocks of color across the warps from edge to edge and measure very carefully how far they have woven using a short measuring stick. They draw out the patterns on sheets of grid school paper, and when the strips are sewn together they form very regular, colorful patterns of crosses, X's, bands, and rectangles that line up perfectly. The result is that the pattern of the textile is not created when the threads are woven as much as it is created when the strips are sewn together. The man on the left is holding up one of these blankets which he will sell to a merchant in the big market. Kente cloth is very famous in America and around the world. It has become an important symbol of African American cultural identity. There have been numerous exhibitions of collections of kente, and kente is included in larger exhibitions of art from all across Africa. Kente is narrow-band, horizontal warp, double-heddle strip-woven cloth. That means it is woven by men on looms that have 2 or more heddles that go up and down, and whose warp threads stretch out horizontally away from the weaver. It is woven in narrow strips, about 4 to 6 inches wide, that are then sewn together to form a full piece of cloth. The yarns all used to be dyed cotton, but now they also include all sorts of man-made fibers, especially rayon. Many other peoples all over West Africa, especially the Yoruba, Baole, Mende, Bamana, Fulani, and Mosi, do the same type of weaving, but the Asante and their neighbors, the Ewe, weave the most elaborate and beautiful textiles. This is the famous Weavers Cooperative in the village of Bonweri in Ghana, just north of Kumasi. Bonweri has been the most famous Asante weaving town for many decades, and it is the center of the Asante kente trade. You can buy an enormous variety of new kente in a huge range of colors and patterns, and you can buy antique kente, which is often much simpler, less colorful, and more beautiful than the newer cloth. The weaver sits facing the loom, with the work bar in his lap, and the warp thread stretching away from him across the loom. Weaving is the intersection of sets of long warp threads with shorter weft threads that meet at right angles, with the wefts passing over and under alternating warps. The colors of both the warp threads and the wefts determine the patterns of the textile. If warps of alternating colors are laid on the loom, the cloth is a warp stripe cloth. If colored wefts are used, the patterns reflect the intersection of the colored warps and wefts. If each weft thread passes over and under bundles of 4 to 8 warp threads, the textile is said to be weft-faced, and the colors of the weft threads will dominate. Asante and Ewe weavers use these techniques to weave cloths with long, brilliant warp stripes over which they weave elaborate tapestry patterns of blocks, triangles, angles, and bands. Short sections of weft patterns alternate with longer sections of warp stripes. The most elaborate cloths are woven of weft patterns so closely spaced that the warps don't show at all. The weaver can lift the warps to create an opening, either by using his fingers or with the help of additional heddles, bound around bundles of warp threads, so that he's not forced to take the time to lift them individually. These extra heddles are only used while he is weaving the complex weft-faced patterns. As you can see, the heddles are controlled by the weaver's feet. Many of the older kente patterns were given individual names, and some were reserved for the use of kings, queens, and the royal family. Nowadays, anyone can purchase any kente pattern he can afford to pay for. Kente patterns have been heavily influenced by feedback from clients. Beautiful old patterns that have not been popular with foreign visitors are woven much less frequently than brilliant patterns of contrasting colors that are avidly sought by tourists, and so are woven in large numbers. Years ago, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer and the exchange rate for dollars and cedis was fixed by the government, the cost of kentes was very high. Now, with the cedi much lower, it is possible to purchase all qualities of kente at much, much lower cost. The Asante people in Ghana make two important types of cloth. Kente cloth is woven on a narrow loom. Adinkra patterns are stamped in black on commercial cotton sheeting that has been dyed black, red, or any of a dozen bright colors. Adinkra began as beaten bark cloth centuries before the Asante began to weave. Broad strips of cloth felted from bark fiber were sewn together with colored thread and then stamped with patterns that represent Asante sayings or aphorisms. This artist works by the side of the road in Kumasi, where people can see him and purchase his work. He is stamping an adinkra that is made up of just one solid sheet of black cloth. He begins by tacking down the cloth to a wooden backing. He then carefully outlines the patterns with a comb dipped in black dye. The dye is made of the boiled bark or seed pods of the acacia tree. Most Asante art represents the nexus or intersection of the verbal and the visual. That is, art patterns and shapes represent visually the sayings about the moral and ethical conduct of life that are otherwise communicated verbally.
They use the bark of a tree.
Yeah. Does he know what the name of the tree is?
Black or red adinkra must be worn at funerals. It is called funeral cloth. Other lighter colors, white, yellow, even pink, are worn at festive occasions. After marking out the outlines, he stamps the patterns using stamps carved from sections of gourd. Each of the patterns has a meaning which he tells us as he shows us the stamps.
Yeah, does it have a meaning? Oh, King of Adinkra. Okay.
That's a good living. Good starting gives you a solid stool.
A good starting gives you a solid what?
Stool.
Stool.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. A coffrin. And these are crossed Ashanti swords, right?
Yeah.
And what does it mean?
You can hear bush taxis and trucks passing on the street behind me. The next time I do this, I will clip a microphone to his shirt so I can hear him better.
All these are not equal. Okay.
All things are not equal.
All
these are not equal. Amphibian-san.
The senior male elders of the Bamago clan in the small village of Dablo in northern Burkina Faso decided to recreate for me the process of smelting iron from raw ore. None of the smiths had done this in at least 50 years, but the eldest could remember quite clearly how it was done. The most senior is named Razinga Bamago, and he directed the entire process. The next most senior is Zaksoba, who was always busy making sure things were done correctly. His name means head of the family home, or responsible man, and true to form he took responsibility for everything. The man who made all the chicken sacrifices and offered prayers to make the process successful is named Nwaga, which means chicken. Just in the 2 years since I made these videos, poor Nwaga has gone totally blind.
C'est une pelle traditionnelle. Maintenant, ils ont fini de déterrer. On rassemble ça maintenant pour transporter. On passe ça dans des paniers pour amener à la maison.
Zaksoba and his relatives dig the iron ore from a deposit near the village. Razinga supervises the sorting of the good solid ore from the useless chunks of dirt.
C'est comme ça, on porte jusqu'à la maison.
These smiths are digging limestone pebbles that are mixed with the ore as a flux, which lowers the temperature at which the iron melts.
On va soulever et puis pour que le bas puisse être identique. C'est pour cela qu'on le fait comme ça.
Zaksoba and Razinga form the core of the furnace from straw and millet stalks and plaster clay around it to form a long tube. These large round bellows will be used to pump air through the tubes, called tuyères, into the fire. Nwaga sacrifices chickens and millet beer to the spirits and asks for their help. Alternating layers of ore mixed with flux and charcoal are added through the top of the furnace. Pumping the bellows is very hard work, and the men drink bowls of zumkom, flour, sugar, and water, to restore their energy.
C'est le fer qui est en train de pleurer.
Late into the night, flames stream from the furnace.
Donc ça veut dire
Finally, what they call the nose, a mass of semi-liquid iron, is visible among the hot coals.
Ça y est, c'est le fer qui est sorti. Ça y est.
The next morning, the Babango men, naturally supervised by Mr. Responsible, cut up the new iron with a chisel. It is hard to imagine what life would be like in Africa or anywhere else without iron tools and weapons. Africans, Asians, and Europeans have used iron for millennia. American cultures did not have iron until the arrival of the earliest European explorers and colonists, and the desperation with which Native Americans acquired iron is testament to its value. African farmers depend on iron hoes for tilling the soil, cultivation of weeds, and harvest. African hunters once depended on iron weapons to kill the game that provided protein for their families, especially during the hungry season. The result has been that the smiths who smelt and forge iron are among the most important members of any farming community. In Dablo, the Bamako smiths smelt raw iron and fashioned tools from the soft high-carbon iron. A pair of bellows force air into the charcoal through two iron tubes. A container of water cools the tools and is used to soak the hot iron to temper it. Here Zaksoba and another elder use a typical West African anvil and round iron hammers to forge a hoe from the new iron they smelted the previous day. It is not hard to see why even elderly smiths are physically fit. The anvil, tongs, and hammer are the three essential smith tools.
C'est une pièce qu'ils sont en train de fabriquer.
Voilà.
At this point, the blade is beginning to spread and flatten. Now the round iron haft begins to take shape. Zaksoba places it on two hammers so he can bend it into a tube. With the haft completed, they hammer out the blade. Zaksoba fits the blade to the wooden handle. The blade is so hot it burns some of the wood to shape, so the blade fits tightly. You can see a large number of the guests who watched the smelting the day before gathered to watch the forging. Many African artists create sculpture using the lost wax casting technique. Yoruba artists in the palace of the king of Ife cast very beautiful naturalistic brass portraits of the kings in the 13th century. The famous casters of the city of Benin cast memorial heads, plaques, and a variety of other royal arts in brass until the British destruction of the palace in 1897, and have continued to cast sculpture to the present. The Mosi of Burkina Faso and many other West African peoples have cast small sculpture, memorial portraits, and equipment for their horses from the 15th century through the beginning of the 21st. Finally, the Asante, whose work we see here, have cast brass gold weights, small figures, containers, and other jewelry and ornaments of brass and gold for centuries.
When Ashanti was captured by a war between Ashanti and the Dentras, he was praying worry with his wife, and Ashanti captured and cut his head.
And cut his head off?
Yes.
The king of Denchira?
Denchira, yeah. Before you cut it, you must...
I visited this small sculptor's workshop just west of Kumasi in Ghana in 2004. The artists were kind and hospitable enough to give me a tour and an introduction to the technique. The process begins when the artist models a figure or piece of jewelry from beeswax. He is careful to include all of the fine details because the completed work will look just like the wax model. The completed wax piece is then covered with a fine layer of clay mixed with ground charcoal. This is called the cream coat. When the first coat is dry, the artists cover it with a thicker coat of coarser clay. Several small pieces may be joined together in one larger mold to make the job of casting go faster. They are joined by thin wax sprues, which connect each piece to a common spout into which the molten brass flows.
So you can join them together. So now you're covering the screws as well as the model inside, so everything is covered.
So we put all the...
They then heat up the wax inside the mold next to a small fire, causing the wax to melt and run out of the mold into a shallow basin, or in this case a small pit, where they can collect and reuse it. Actually, the wax is not lost.
And fetch into the hole and enter the bowl on this crucible.
Okay.
And set it.
A second hollow container is fashioned of clay, and this is filled with scrap brass, copper, and tin. The artists then join this crucible filled with brass to the empty clay mold and seal the joint with fresh clay.
And you get this shape. You see, this place is the blast and the mold.
All of those shapes already have an empty mold, and they have a container with brass.
Brass, yes. Oh, this one.
Okay.
We have set brass on it.
The casters fill a large furnace with empty molds and crucibles, with the crucible part down, where the brass can melt. The entire load of molds is filled with charcoal and lighted. The casters use an electric bellows to pump lots of air into the firing so it gets very hot. Late in the evening, when the molds are red hot and the brass is melted, the casters pull them from the fire with iron tongs and roll them down a small hill. At this point, the molten brass fills the empty space left when the wax was melted away. The casters arrange the molds with the crucible up and the void down to fill with brass and to cool. The next morning, the casters break open the molds, remove the new brass piece, cut off the lines that carried the molten brass, and clean and polish them for sale.
You're just washing them in water?
Yes.
But then you're brushing them with a wire brush?
Yes.
And that removes all of the old clay?
No, we are moving on the clay. No, now, you are turning the brass.
Okay.
So now, I want to make cream.
Okay.
So you are washing with a...
lemon?
Lemon.
Okay.
Yes.
So lemon juice to clean
yes.
off?
Yes.
Okay.
So after lemon, you are using the brush and make clean.
See, the brass, no wax. It's ready to coat.
Clay is a fascinating material. It is very abundant in Africa. In fact, Africa is pretty much made of clay. It is very plastic and can easily be shaped into almost any form we need. It is permanent. Once it has been fired, it will survive almost forever, unless a potter grinds it up to make temper. Archaeologists love it because it survives burial so well and provides an almost endless source of shards in excavations, shards that tell us a lot about the ancient and recent past. It is ironic that the two most durable of materials we use are gold and fired clay, the most precious and the cheapest of materials. I have been fascinated by clay ever since I went to Burkina Faso for the first time in 1970 as a new Peace Corps volunteer. My job was to organize a pottery section at the National Art Center in Ouagadougou. I spent lots of time exploring the many areas of Burkina where potters created large, useful, well-made, and often very beautiful clay containers and sculpture. I discovered that there was a set of well-established techniques that were shared by potters all over the country to make their containers. For a long time I thought there were 4 basic techniques: concave mold, convex mold, direct pull, and coiling. Then in 2001 I found a 5th, hammer and anvil. Again, the one technique that was not present in black Africa until the colonial period was the use of the potter's wheel. I'm sure that in the vastness of the African continent there are other techniques I've never seen. I hope that as time goes by, other scholars will document these same techniques. The following video is about the ways potters form containers and then fire them. Not all the details are there, or the video would be much too long. My video, titled African Pottery Techniques, is longer and more detailed, especially about the preparation of the clay. I hope that this more brief film will help students and scholars understand the simple but effective, appropriate technologies that Africans have used for a very long time to create useful, interesting, and beautiful shapes. I only came across this technique in 2001 when I visited the potter Maria Kafando in a small village near Kombasiri, about 30 miles south of Ouagadougou. Mrs. Kafando forms a bowl-shaped form using the convex mold technique and then thins it and rounds it over a round mold that remains inside the new jar until it is almost completely covered and spherical. She then removes the mold from inside the new jar by extracting it in a technique that can only be compared to the episiotomy performed on women in childbirth. She then repairs the 4 tears and continues to shape around the new container with a round anvil inside and a concave hammer outside the jar. She forms the rim with a coil of fresh clay.
I mean, to matter, I was away. Into watching the tondo.
Here Mrs. Cafando is smoothing the exterior of the jar with wet clay and burnishing it with a string of seeds from a baobab tree. I have known Mrs. Konate for 25 years. Over the years her goiter has grown in size and she has turned over the strenuous coiling to her daughter-in-law, and she now just makes the bases of big jars. Her home is decorated with 8x10 black and white glossies I have taken of her and her family over the years. This is a very simple and straightforward technique. The potter uses an overturned jar as a mold on which she pounds out fresh clay to form a new jar. The shape of the mold and of the product are identical. By the time the new jar is fired, they are identical in size as well. Here again, stiff clay is needed to prevent distortion when the new jar is lifted off the mold. And again, the potter may use the coiling technique to form very large containers for brewing millet beer or soaking cassava. I have seen potters all over Burkina use this technique, but the largest operation I've seen is the famous Dada compound in Ilorin in Nigeria, which I visited in 1991 when I did not have a video camera. Most of the potters I know who use the concave mold technique are in Burkina, although there are documents that describe the technique in Niger and Nigeria. The technique requires pretty stiff clay, so the potter adds lots of ground clay timber and organic material as she needs the clay. The potter begins with a shallow concave mold, either in the floor of her workshop or a portable mold. She places a mass of fresh clay in the mold and hammers it thin with a mallet held in her right hand. She quickly fills the mold with fresh clay and then tilts the new form up on one edge to continue to fill the shallow mold. In this way she can make a very uniform symmetrical container from a mold that is only a quarter of a sphere.
Amanda,
parce que avant-hier, quand je venais là, j'ai un frère qui est au conseil, il dit que je viens pour il y a un ressortissant du village là qui est chez lui. Ils l'ont passé.
After the spherical shape is complete, she uses the coiling technique either to increase the height or to add the rim. There are some male potters in Burkina and elsewhere in Africa, and those I know use the concave mold technique. However, the vast majority of potters in Burkina and the rest of Africa are women. 9/10 of these women are the wives of smiths. Both pottery and smithing require the use of fire to transform earthen materials into containers and tools. Perhaps this is why the two technologies seem to go hand in hand. Coiling is a rather spectacular technique when the potter is making a large jar to be used for brewing beer or soaking root crops. The same technique is used all over Africa, as well as in Japan and Korea. The base of the jar may start with the convex mold technique, as here in Uri in Burkina Faso, but then the potter slowly builds the walls higher and higher as she walks around the new jar, usually backwards. Such large jars are less uniform and symmetrical than the products of other techniques, but because the new jar is stationary, much larger containers are possible. Finally, in whatever scale, potters use coils to finish off most jars made using all of the other techniques. Lots and lots of potters all over Africa use this technique, and there are many variations. The potter begins with a well-kneaded mass of fresh clay. She forces her fist down into the clay to form an opening, and then pulls and thins and squeezes the clay upward to form the walls of the new jar. The technique often requires the addition of fresh clay by coiling, and in the end the walls and base may be rather thick. The potter thins the jar and makes it more uniform by scraping the exterior with a piece of bamboo, a mussel shell, or a sharp metal ring. Some potters, notably Awa Diabate in Pelignan, form the base of the jar first. Other potters, such as those in Ghana, form the upper half first and then turn the jar upside down to complete the bottom. You can see both of these variations in the video that follows. The most spectacular part of pottery production is firing. Pottery is fired to a low temperature, hot enough to drive the molecules of water from the clay, but low enough that the clay does not melt and fuse. The result is a clay body that is strong enough to hold water, grain, or food, and will not deteriorate over time, but is not heated to a stiff, inflexible crystalline structure like stoneware and porcelain. Such low-fired pottery can easily be used to cook over an open fire, because its open structure permits it to expand and contract without breaking. The firing usually lasts no more than an hour, with no kiln at all, and a minimum of locally available fuel. This firing by Awa Diabate and her sisters-in-law in a jelly village in southwest Burkina includes just her pots. All of the women help fire each other's pots. The rate of breakage in the firing is very low. As you can see, the construction of the kiln is simple and effective, requiring very little labor or materials and no external source of gas or electricity. This is certainly an appropriate technology for rural Africa. Soaking the red-hot pottery in a soup or stew of boiled acacia seed pods results in a reduction firing, in which lots of fuel and very little oxygen changes the red iron to black iron, and makes the pottery both more attractive and more useful for cooking and storing water. The reduction firing may increase the resistance of the jars to the thermal shock of cooking over an open fire.